All right. Welcome everyone to our event on energy data sharing and the case of electric vehicle smart charging. My name is Mala Geibel. I'm a project officer here at SARE, and I have the great pleasure to moderate today's event. Yesterday, SARE has launched a report exactly on the topic that we're discussing today, and we're very happy to have both of the authors with us, Sean Ennis from the University of East Anglia, and also Giuseppe Colangelo from the University of Basilicata. And they'll both later on present their main findings and recommendations to us. First, let me maybe go through the agenda of today's event. We are going to start today's event with hearing a keynote speech from George Panesco, who is a policy officer at the European Commission's DG Energy. He's going to talk about the action plan on digitalization of energy, which has been published yesterday. Very timely for our discussion today. We will then hear the report presentation by our two main authors and research fellows that I've just introduced. And this presentation will then be followed by a panel discussion. So the discussion will be between representatives of the European Commission, regulators, and several from the industry. And I'm very looking forward to a rich discussion. Let me please welcome with us today Anna Ludin, who is a policy officer at the European Commission's DG Connect. Also with us, Charles Clark, who's a senior manager for data policy and regulation at Ofgem. Welcome to Enzo Ribaniak, EU public policy advisor at Huawei Technologies. And last but not least, Quentin Metzler, who's a chief marketing strategy and development officer at Drake. Before we get going, let me just go over a couple of housekeeping rules. So this is a very interactive event. We are encouraging everyone who's watching us over Zoom, over YouTube, to submit their questions, comments, anything they would like to just include into our discussion. You can either use the question and answer section here on Zoom, or if you're watching us over YouTube, please use the live chat. Me and my team will make sure that we're monitoring all your questions and bring them in at any time. And we would also encourage everyone who would like to join our discussion to do that on Twitter using the hashtag SareLaunch. Okay, that's everything from my side so far. I would now, without further ado, like to give the floor to George and his presentation on the action plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Marla, and let me thank Sarah for the invitation to be here today. And good afternoon, everyone. I will have a brief introduction for today's discussion, and I will refer to the key elements of the policy landscape in the EU that I think are relevant for the discussion of today. Next slide, please. Yeah, and the next one. I will refer to actually four main elements, a bit brief in the beginning, and I will focus on the action plan that was mentioned by Marla. But in these four elements, and starting in chronological order, I need to start with the European Green Deal, which was published in 2019, and it's the new growth strategy that underpins all our efforts, including decarbonization. You have here all the details, the objectives. I'll not enter into details, you know it, but I wanted to mention that very importantly, in terms of funding, this strategy is supported by around 1/3 of the EU's financial envelope of 1.8 trillion euros, which are earmarks for investments in this 7-year budget, 2021-2027, and under the Next Generation EU Recovery Plan. The second element for today, next slide, is the comprehensive legal set of proposals to implement the European Green Deal that was put forward last year, and which aims to make a range of EU policies fit for reducing the net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030, compared to 1990 levels. Energy is part and parcel of that, a very important part, and again, I will not go into details here. Next slide, please. The third key point of today, the Repower EU plan. As we see, unfortunately, there are other external factors which are adding to the global picture. These are unprecedented challenges, which seemed unthinkable just several months ago. And we sadly witness here in Europe an unprovoked invasion. And that also has huge implications on the energy sector. So apart from the decarbonization targets and the need to transform the energy system, we now have a new element of urgency and acting on this. Therefore, the Commission adopted in March the Repower EU communication, and in May, it followed with a more detailed Repower EU plan, which is about rapidly reducing our dependence on Russian fossil fuels and to fast forward the green transition. And you have here the main strands of action under the plan, which are saving energy by promoting energy efficiency, enhancing preparedness. They refer to diversifying energy supplies, to quickly substituting fossil fuels, and accelerating Europe's clean energy transition, and to combine smartly investments and reforms. Next slide, please. And now the fourth element for today, and the star of that came into picture just yesterday. It's very fresh. The Commission adopted yesterday the action plan on digitalizing the energy system. And the plan covers 5 main areas of action. You see them depicted here, and they address both facets of the coin. So we are not only looking at the huge opportunities brought by digitalization, but also looking at the challenges, such as the need for better cybersecurity, strengthen cybersecurity, and to keep in check the increases in energy consumption. Well, you see here we have communication in terms of technical documents coming from the Commission. We have a communication and the staff working document. So in the communication, you have the main actions and key messages. In the staff working document, you have a lot of underpinning technical details and examples. So an exciting reading, I should say. And as you see, we have here a specific action dedicated to data exchanges. Next slide, please. This regarding to the data exchanges in the energy sector, we have a big opportunity here. We have a key enabler for digitalized energy systems, which is the availability of data, the capacity to access it, and to share the energy-related data. But also this might become rapidly an issue if increased market fragmentation and blockages and bottlenecks are across the value chains. And therefore, the aim of the actions in the action plan is to the vision, the global aim is to facilitate the development of innovative energy solutions and inclusive services, looking at both developing the grids and strengthening the grids, but also engaging consumers, allowing them to act as prosumers and have an active role and or active consumers, active in the system, and therefore lowering their bills. And also looking at the further integration of the markets, energy markets across the EU. And the means to do that is by developing a European framework for sharing energy data. And this is done by establishing a common European data space for energy. The approach we took in doing all this, it's described in our documents, a lot of details, as I said, in the staff working document. And this is after thorough consultations with you, the stakeholders. We heard that we need coordinated EU action, working in partnership, having an approach based on clear use cases, use the building blocks which are developed, which are already deployed, and ensure interoperability. This is a key word here, interoperability, and this is needed both intra-sectoral for the energy sector, but also for cross-sectoral, for instance, between energy and mobility sectors. And last slide, please. So it's clear that energy and data go hand in hand. This is why we have the twin green and digital transitions, which are reinforcing each other. But here there's a but. We need to take positive actions for making sure that they reinforce, they do so at their full potential. And for that, for instance, in energy, we need to strengthen our smart energy systems. And that, of course, relies on the use of data. And moving towards other sector integration and electrification are key for reaching a decarbonization goal. And mobility is a success story, is becoming a success story even more so. And for that, we need sound and effective interfaces between sectors, notably between energy and mobility. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Thanks for outlining the next steps foreseen in the action plan. Very exciting indeed. So I think you've delivered many very crucial elements that we'll be discussing later on in our panel. But before we get to that, let me please give the floor to our two research fellows and authors of the report, Sean and Giuseppe.
Thank you very much, Marla. So I would like to start by talking about the objective and approach that we have used in our work, and the objective comes out of looking at a European energy data space and then thinking of exactly what George was just talking about, one particular use case, and ours is smart charging. And the idea is to focus on some of the data needs that are present for smart charging to work well, and the types of transactions that need to be taking place in a smart charging network. And we actually think about a variety of possible networks, structures that could be in place in the future, and they might vary from user to user and from country to country. And then we're going to examine the energy-specific regulatory framework that is existing, and talk about some of the regulatory challenges for smart charging, and in particular, making sure that the data flows will be working well in multiple contracting scenarios. And then we're going to talk about some recommendations that we've come up with at the end. So in terms of smart charging, this is much more than if you think of smart meters. So for people who haven't dealt with smart charging before, this is much more than smart meters. This is really about the idea that batteries in electric vehicles can not only take charge from the network at times that are adjustable. So it's not simply that you plug in your car and you immediately take energy from the network, but you can take energy from the network at different times while you're connected, at times that are in some sense optimal for the network or that are at the prices that you want to pay. But you can also, if these smart chargers are designed for it, contribute energy into the system from the electric vehicle. And this is potentially a very important source of on-demand power for the European energy networks in the long run. And it's really an important source of power because of the constraints of many renewable energy sources such as wind and solar, which are not always on, and which are not, in the case of wind, not completely predictable as to when they will be operating. Batteries can help to fill in the missing energy when the renewables are not up and running, but also can help to absorb the extra production that comes into play when there's very high levels of wind that are above those that are necessary for feeding the network at a particular time. So we're very interested in how the use of these batteries will interact with data sharing and interoperability of systems. You can imagine a variety of different contractual structures, and those will depend critically on the data sharing possibilities. So we are still at a very early time for this, in the sense that there's a lot of innovation at the grid that can happen. Charging stations are still being installed, and there's very likely a need for a major push in installing more charging stations. And this is a very good time to be thinking about bidirectional charging and how this system would work for contributing energy to the network from batteries. It will be important to align the interests as much as possible to support the rollout of smart charging in order to reach some of these objectives of CO2 reduction and greenhouse gas reduction. So if we could move to the next slide. We've got some criteria that we've considered that we think are really important for a successful use of data in this smart charging world. And one of them is that the information provided in one format could be read by all users eligible to access the data, and that the information required for optimization of the energy system could be sent by the vehicle to multiple parties who have a legitimate link to the battery recharging process and to that energy optimization. We think that another criterion would be that smart charging of data and vehicle to grid functionality is accessible to any third party upon the final customer decision. So one possibility would be that there would be restrictions on what the customer wanted to do with their data. This would provide the customer with the ability to move their data around, and at their discretion. And then we think that energy sources that are viable should be given an incentive to produce, as long as that is profitable. So if you are driving in many parts of Europe, you'll often see wind production that's at a standstill, even when there's wind that's clearly available. So this means that energy sources are not being used because there's not a call to bring them into the system. And if having smart charging and linking it up to these possibilities will be an important feature of future networks. It's very important to ensure that profitable storage is incentivized to occur, and for batteries to be purchased where there is profitable storage, and that battery charging stations themselves can earn a sufficient return to also be given an incentive to build out in line with the expected future demand, which still requires a very substantial build out as in quite a few member states. And now we'll hand over to Giuseppe.
Thank you very much, Sean. Well, we move from specific premises that the data sharing frameworks are key in the realization of smart charging initiative. Accordingly, we briefly summarize the main feature of the legislative initiatives undertaken in Europe in the last years, aiming at promoting data sharing, starting from the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which ensuring general data portability right for individuals, moving to the second Payment Service Directive, which is a sector-specific intervention that grants an in-situ access right to data, with also taking into account the regulation of the free flow of personal data, the Open Data Directive, the Data Governance Act, and more recently, we took a look at the recently approved Digital Markets Act and to the proposal for a Data Act, which envisage some interoperability obligation to tackle concern about user lock-in. The Data Act, the proposal of the Data Act requires further attention, since it is not only an horizontal initiative that is going to apply for all sectors, and it's going to cover business to consumer, business to business relationship, as well as personal and non-personal data. But what is relevant for the sake of our analysis is that it includes vehicles in its scope as products that obtain, generate, collect data. Finally, we have to mention that the role of interoperability has been confirmed also in the recent proposal for a European health data space, the first common data space in a specific area that emerged from the European strategy for data. Overall, we know that although such initiative significantly differ among themselves in terms of approaches, in terms of scopes, however, they share an essential technical feature, the reliance on application programming interface as a key enabler to ensure an effective data sharing ecosystem. We may move to the next slide, please. Okay, then our analysis focuses on energy-specific data sharing regime, given that the development of charging infrastructure for electric vehicles was already addressed in 2014 by the deployment of alternative fuels infrastructure directive. Nonetheless, the directive did not outline smart charging of vehicle to grid and its electricity system integration. More recently, we underline that in the electricity sector, the regulation 1485 of 2017 introduced data sharing obligation for electricity network operator to ensure system security. The electricity directive requires states to ensure the deployment of a smart metering system, which should be interoperable, in particular with consumer energy management system and smart grids. Moreover, we have the proposed revision of the Renewable Source Directive that introduced measures addressing the need for real-time access to basic battery information for facilitating the integration related operation of domestic batteries and electric vehicles. On the very same date, the Commission also released the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation proposal, under which all new public accessible charging stations have to be digitally connected and capable of smart charging. Finally, if we look at the role of buildings in relation to smart charging and bidirectional charging, as research point where electric vehicles typically park for extended periods of time are obviously relevant to energy system integration, we may take a look at the proposed revision of Energy Performance of Building Directive, which established that states shall ensure building owners, tenants, managers to have direct access to their building system data, and the access of the data shall be made available to third parties. And we may move to the next slide, please. Against this overall background, we maintain that the main regulatory challenges are represented by the policy choices related to interoperability and standardization, in particular the option for a mandated rather than a facilitated API adoption, and concern about privacy and cybersecurity. And to illustrate potential data-related solution for smart charging, we decide to investigate UK and UX experience. With regard to the former, the UK Antitrust Authority, UK Competition Markets Authority, explicitly referred to the open banking, where 9 major banks were required to agree on a common and open API standards, data formats, and security protocols, as a blueprint to maximize the benefits of smart charging, and recommending the government to set open data and software standards. According to the CMA, in light of this previous experience in the retail banking, open standard can ensure people that are not locked in to charge point operator interface may have the choice of alternatives and to manage the charge point from third parties. Moreover, open standard will make it easier for third party to develop innovative solution and application. We also know that by evaluating the application of the open banking solution to electric vehicle smart charging, The UK government face a trade-off, given that the diversity in business model practice. While it's important for innovation, there is a risk of proliferation of smart charge point system developing varying standard and functionality. Nonetheless, the banking industry is much more mature than the electric vehicle industry. Hence, there is also risk that mandating specific solution in a market at early stage may undermine innovation, lower incentive to invest. And we just know that according to the impact assessment of the UK Electric Vehicles Regulation 2021, there is still limited evidence for mandating specific solution that meet smart charging policy objective. Hence, the UK government opted for the introduction of a minimum set of mandatory requirements for new private charge points, evidence showing that such charge points have a smart functionality and meet certain device level requirement, enabling a minimum level of access, security, and information from consumer. The relevance of defining common and open API standards, data formats, and security protocol is shared by the US initiative to build up a national electric vehicle charging network. To the same, also in the US, it has been proposed to establish regulations setting minimum standards with regards, among the other things, the interoperability of charging infrastructure, the network connectivity of charging infrastructure, and the information on publicly available charging infrastructure location, price, real-time availability, and accessibility through mapping application. I will leave the floor to Sean to illustrate the different scenario for bidirectional smart charging we investigated.
And we have investigated different scenarios because it seems like there are many different potential contracting opportunities. And if we were to fully list the number of potential entities involved in the movement of energy in bidirectional smart charging, it's really a very long list. So we have chosen to focus on 3 that are, in a sense, the most, what could be argued as the most critical parts of the picture, which are starting with the vehicle, and then moving up to an aggregator level, and then dealing with TSO, DSO generation level. And that's the generation level is particularly for the purchase of electricity for the cars. And what we're trying to do is illustrate some of the bidirectional data needs that might possibly exist in the future, even if they don't exist now. And one of our arguments would be that we would like to see data flows capable of supporting multiple scenarios. So not just designed to fit one scenario, but able to deal with multiple opportunities, and even with cars that are moving from one scenario to another scenario, which is quite a natural outcome. It's important to remember that cars are typically parked about 95% of the time. So there's a very high opportunity for them to be flexible, both in their drawing of energy from the network and pushing of energy into the network. So the first scenario, which is largely hypothetical for the moment, is one in which a vehicle is, in a sense, contracting directly with the grid to provide energy to the grid, or also flexibility to the grid. And this is one type of contracting that could occur, you could imagine, over an application between the vehicle owner and the grid owner, but it would be very atypical to see this type of purchase or sale of energy at the moment. Another scenario is one in which vehicles would be providing their energy to an aggregator, who in turn would be providing to a grid, and they would equally be deriving from an aggregator. and from the grid. And it could be that they're dealing with different, a vehicle might deal with different providers for selling and for purchasing, and they might choose to deal with different providers at different points in time. So they might find that there's one provider with a very low price for energy that they wish to purchase from, and they might also find there's later on a provider with a very high purchase price for the energy from their vehicle who they would like to sell to later. So locking in unique paths on this process will actually close down many opportunities for contracting in the future. If we're interested in maintaining the maximum incentives to own bidirectional batteries and for them to contribute to the network, I think it's important for them to have many contracting opportunities. If we move on to scenario 3, this is focused on what is one possible outcome, which would be to have the vehicle car manufacturer serving as intermediary for all communications and all data movements between the vehicle and other parties. So let's imagine the grid. So the car manufacturer would then, in a sense, become a supplier of intermediate supplier of energy to and from the networks. And then the disadvantage of this would be that it would close down many opportunities for arbitrage gains potentially that might have been explored through direct contracting between the vehicle owner and sellers and buyers of energy. And so if this were to be the scenario that's the primary scenario in the future, there would be a lot of perhaps less incentive to install bidirectional charging facilities and to participate in the arbitrage opportunities that are available. And then the final scenario is one of complete grid bypass. That's very rare today also, but some people have talked about microgeneration as an important trend in the future. And you could imagine, for example, that a car owner might live in a place in which there is microgeneration, and there's no potential connection to the no connection to the grid in that case, but where they might have their own wind power facilities or other solar facilities that would be charging the car. And you could also imagine that the car in this location might then move as somebody leaves home, for example, goes to work, might move from this scenario to another scenario in which, if they're at work, there would be often a building which might have charging infrastructure, bidirectional charging infrastructure, and which would then allow the person who had created their own energy supply to sell that on the network. So these are illustrating quite different possibilities for contracting over supply and sale of energy involving electric vehicle batteries. And I think one of our views on any regulatory challenges is that they should be taking into account some of these very different possibilities. So if we could move on now. We have some recommendations, and I think we'll ask Giuseppe, I'm going to ask Giuseppe to talk about those that follow on from the work that we've been doing and from the desire to maintain broad contracting possibilities across multiple scenarios.
Thank you, Sean. As shown in the report, data flows will be crucial to determining which outcomes are provided by the market. And given that we fear that the failure to require openness at this early stage is not necessarily going to be counteracted by customer demand for openness, and that could generate a lock-in situation for customer, we briefly outline these 5 main recommendations that you may see over the slide. That is, first of all, to require car manufacturer to adopt open and portable standards for battery charging and electricity supply with function available to any third party chosen by the customer. Such data standard would not need to be identical for all providers and countries. Second of all, ensuring that customers with no reasonable alternative, with no reasonable choices, are not locked by data system into purchasing energy from one charger that does not offer competitive rates. Third, to ensure that privacy safeguards are in place to protect consumer information about their movement. Then to ensure the sufficient transactional standard in place so that energy payments are secure. And finally, avoiding to impose obligation to supplier to buy from electric vehicles. Thus, electric vehicle would compete with other sources of energy and would not be guaranteed to provide energy when the economic conditions were not desirable, or are not be guaranteed prices above the market rate. We look forward to collect feedbacks and see the reaction of the panel of discussant. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much both for this very insightful presentation. I think you've delivered us a lot of meat to be discussed later during our panel. It is a great report. Everyone make sure to check it out. We will also share the link with you after this event again. Yeah, looking at the time, we now have around about an hour to discuss your findings with our panel and of course also the audience watching us. I have introduced them earlier today, but you can see everyone again on the screen. So hello again, Anna, Charles, Enzo, and Quentin. Georgia will also be able to answer some questions towards the end of this panel. And I would say let's get started. For the beginning of this panel, I would maybe ask everyone to just briefly give their first thoughts on the report. What did you like about it? What do you make out of the recommendations? And also, what do you actually criticize? And I would like to give the floor first to Anna.
Thank you, Mala. Thank you very much also for the kind invitation. I'm very happy to join this panel today. And I have to say the report was very insightful, also this presentation today for me. I come from this horizontal policy perspective on data access and use. And for me, it's of course very interesting then to dive into such a detailed use case. And as I understand, it's actually several use cases when we talk about EV smart charging. So that is very interesting. And I think what I understand from the report, that many things are very much in line with what we already do in horizontal data policy, namely, for example, with the latest Data Act proposal. So, for example, our intention to enable more access for more players around IoT is also very much in line, of course, with the concept that is developed in the report. And I understand also from Giuseppe's explanation that mapping the whole legislation that is here around, there are common principles, and that's exactly what we try to do also with the horizontal data policy, basically understanding what are the common principles and laying them out, basically, namely in the Data Act proposal. So that is for a start from my perspective, what was very interesting. I'm also happy to see that in the recommendations, there is not explicitly now a call for, I would say, more data access for more eligible parties. So at least not explicitly mentioned in the recommendations. It's more about standardization. And I think the technical means how to enable the data access. But for me, it is interesting to see that at least you don't call for explicitly more eligible parties for now, because I think with the Data Act proposal, for example, we have already a concept out there where the user would be in the center of the perception. So the user that can be a consumer or a business that is owning, for example, the car or renting or leasing it. And with this user-centered basically conception, I think also the report is very much in line with this construction, and so I'm very interested to hear more thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's great to have the horizontal perspective on the panel today. I would now move over to Charles and the UK's perspective, please.
Thank you very much, Marla. And again, thank you, if I can just echo Anna there, thank you for inviting us along and giving me the opportunity to contribute to this panel and this paper. I would like to congratulate Sean and Giuseppe and the rest of the academic team on what is a very insightful and well-written piece that we've been discussing quite substantially over here in the UK. I'm personally of the view that it could not be more timely as well, given obviously the Data Act coming out literally just yesterday, and on my morning read, I was reading a Bloomberg piece about how 87 different countries throughout the world are approaching that 5% tipping point to mainstream adoption of green technologies, of which the electric vehicle is very much the forefront of. I think we're something in the region of 18% of all new vehicle sales in 2021 in the UK, and obviously similar figures for Europe, and leading up to 3,500 gigawatt hours potentially on the roads, or more realistically on the pavements and driveways where they're parked. And I think this is very much at the point where something that was niche is going to become very quickly, I would expect, the mainstream and the common part. And I think the paper is a fascinating look at it, and I would focus personally on the standards, data standards, mandating or evolving naturally as being one of those questions I don't think there is an easy answer to. I don't think there's also a one-size-fits-all answer, and it's one that we've been wrestling with here in the UK. Again, we have the background of open banking, which I'm not going to talk about too much now, but it's one where I believe there may not necessarily be one single right answer, but there are an awful lot of potential wrong answers, and it's one I'm eager to explore with the panel. Thank you very much, Marla.
Thank you, Charles. We will certainly come back to the point of standardization later on. And so over to you, please, and your initial thoughts.
Thanks, Marla, and thanks a lot for inviting me as well today. It's a pleasure to be here and to hear also the views, but also from the action plan. It was nice to hear as well, as it's very timely, and yesterday it came out. About the report, I'm still very excited about the scenario that Shen displayed. And I think overall, this is a great report because he managed to sort of bringing us together and make us speak the same language, because here we have, tech industry, the energy sector, the mobility or transport sector, and it's not often that we're able to speak with each other, but also speak the same language, because that's what it is about at the end of the day. And here I mean technical language, and using the same words, because if we don't use the same words, how would we expect our technologies even to speak the same words and to say similar things to each other, so that they can interact with each other and be interoperable? So I think that's the very first thing about this report, is this ability to do such thing. And for example, all this part concerning the energy data needs, for me, it was a great opportunity to learn all of this, to understand exactly where the needs of data lies in this industry, and sort of understand why and where are the challenges. And then from more of a tech industry point of view, I think what is great here is that it sort of translates the same points that we say concerning data in general. And here, I'm very happy to see all the findings concerning, the opportunities to leverage the data, the different interoperability needs that Charles also mentioned before, standards needs, etc. And something that I think it's very key as well in the report, it's how it puts the consumers in the middle of all of this. The ability of the consumers not to be locked in, the ability of the different actors not to be locked out, and the ability also, when it mentions privacy, to bring trust within the conversation, so that the user wants to leverage this technology and wants to be included in all of this. So, great report again, and congratulations, Giuseppe and Charles, for doing this, and also Sarah, obviously.
Thank you very much. And then we have, last but not least, Quentin. Can I introduce you to share your thoughts on the report, please?
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation on this great paper. Maybe to talk on our position. So Drive is part of EDF Group. We are an IT platform providing smart charging and vehicle-to-grid optimization and aggregation services. So we are really at the core of this use case. And such a platform that we develop only works with data. If we don't have all the data needed, basically the quality of service and the customer experience won't be good. Maybe to illustrate a very concrete example of this problem of data with what we are currently doing. This winter, you know that all the power system will be challenged because of the very high prices during peak period. And also maybe the electricity won't be available if the weather is too cold and the consumption too high, at least in France, but I understood maybe it could be the case in other countries. And so we are currently connected to the maximum of charger of companies to avoid the consumption of electric cars during peak time, while ensuring the car are charged when the user needs their car, because of course it is essential. And today we have the difficulty right now, we don't have the access of a state of charge of a car. We don't have a battery capacity, even we are connected to a charger. So we do a blind optimization, which is not optimal from an economic point of view, from the power system point of view, and also from the user experience point of view. And so the reason of this is because basically the current charging protocols and hardware does not allow the charger to have access to these informations. And also the electric cars, as they are connected devices, they have this information, they could communicate this information. But if you ask the car manufacturers, they will make you pay, which hinders this kind of service. So this is why smart charging and vehicle to grid, it's I think a good illustration of to show the critical role of data policy regarding all the energy services and climate ambition. And so I fully align with all the conclusion of the papers. And so thank you so much.
Thanks, Quentin. And that sounds very good. I think our authors will be very happy with these first reactions. Yeah, so for the next 30 minutes, I would now like to move to a bit more concrete points and still also encourage our audience online to submit their questions. Quentin, to just follow up on what you've just said, it's very handy to have you here today, speaking from the core of the case study that we're discussing. Indeed, so you were mentioning the problematic of having not sufficient access to data, and we've now heard from Georgia and what the Commission is working on from a regulatory perspective. Could you maybe just develop a little bit more from your point of view? What are the most critical obstacles to data access? And also, is it a problem? Is it a regulatory problem? Is it a problem of intermediaries, manufacturers? You could just elaborate a bit more on that, please. Thanks.
Yeah. So basically, we have two problems here, a regulatory problem and a problem of, let's say, manufacturers, chargers and car manufacturers. The first problem regarding the regulatory problem is standardization and interoperability. So basically, you may know that regarding the charging connectors, so basically the plugs, now it is standardized within Europe. So if you charge in a charger in Germany, in France, etc., it is the same type of plug, the same type of charger. However, the protocol inside the connector exchanging data between the car and the charger, there is a standard, but it is not mandatory for the car manufacturer to implement it. So the standard is called the 15.11.8, and you have different versions, able to do smart charging or able to do vehicle to grid, for example. And so the example given earlier of the US, basically the US will impose these standards. It will be mandatory for all the chargers to implement this precise standard. The problem we have right now is that depending on the car manufacturers and charger manufacturers, you can implement or not this charging protocol. And if you want to adapt slightly the version of the protocol, you can do it. So basically, it's quite complex now to work with different car manufacturers and charger manufacturers, because you work with a car manufacturer one, they say, okay, I implemented this type of version, but it's not the same than the car manufacturer number 2 in Europe. And so your charger manufacturer will say, okay, so which kind of protocol do I have to speak? So basically, right now, this is a big waste of time and a big waste of costs, because maybe we will produce some chargers that won't be future-proof and interoperable. So this is the first topic, and this is why I think the example in the UK and the US are great, and we should do the same. And the other point is the availability of the data. So if all the hardware is compatible, this is very good. But if you have a vendor lock-in, for example, the car manufacturer, we know they want to develop this kind of energy services business. And a lot of them want to keep this data for them and make you pay for this data. And so this is also another problem because it will hinder this kind of business model, this type of energy services, or lock the customer with just one provider of service, the car manufacturer.
Thank you, Quentin. So you pointed out lack of standardization issues and availability of data. And I would take the chance now that we have Anna with us today to bring her in on this point and to give us a bit of a horizontal view on this. Maybe you could elaborate a bit more from what you told us about your work. What guiding principles the Commission is working on with regards to that matter, and how to increase transparency between all mentioned actors to share the data, to access it.
Thank you, Mala. Yeah, I would maybe start to react briefly also to what was just described, and then also answer your question on trust and transparency. As you know, with the Data Act proposal, as I mentioned earlier, we have this chapter on IoT data access. That means we looked at different sectors and saw the concerns in different sectors that more and more the users locked in basically and cannot access the data that is generated with the use of its object, meaning the object that he owns or rents or leases. And the manufacturer is more and more in a position to exclusively use that data and offer then services on the basis of that data, and basically to enable the user not only to access the data but also to allow for more innovation around these objects. We enable that through an access right for the user to access the data that is generated with the use of the object directly from what we call the data holder, that is the manufacturer, but also we give the user the right to port the data to a third party that he selects. So basically, we are of course aware of the fact that the user will not always be in a position to innovate himself, but he would rather than want to choose a service of a third party, and for that, the third party should then access the data also directly from the manufacturer. And with that, we hope to have more innovative services around these objects. So this is the concept from the Data Act, which could possibly also solve certain vendor lock-ins, as were mentioned right now. This is the concept that tries really to give more actors access to certain data around IoT objects, and that includes also cars and could also include, for example, a charging station. Then on guiding principles around trust and transparency, I think when we speak about transparency, one part of the data policy is also interesting here, that is open data policy. In the field of open data policy, we speak about data from the public sector that is made available under hopefully good conditions for everyone to use them. And of course, we know when we talk about maps, when we talk about location, for example, of charging stations, etc., we hope, of course, that this kind of data is made available under very good conditions so that they can be used, and also, of course, then enable this whole infrastructure better. So I think this transparency aspect, open data policy, so what can be unlocked maybe from the public sector side is kind of interesting also in this area. And then, but when we come to speak about B2B and trust there, the DGI the Data Governance Act was an important instrument here, because its aim was to create more trust between actors through different tools, actually. And one of them is the role of intermediaries. And with the DGA, we have one chapter on so-called data intermediaries. Those actors should be neutral actors that stand between supply and demand of data in different sectors, and that have no self-interest, basically no own interest in monetizing the data, but really stick to their role of intermediating between supply and demand of data. And with that, we want to create more trust, basically, in those transactions. And so it is also very interesting to see what role intermediaries could play in the field of energy.
Thanks again, Anna, for providing us with that insight. I would now want to bring Charles into this discussion and to focus a bit more on the mentioned element of a lack of interoperability. As we've heard during the presentation, the UK plays a big role in our report, and Charles has mentioned himself the open banking strategy. Charles, I would like to ask you, do you think that this model that we've been presented is viable for a young market like smart charging?
Thank you, Marla. I think it's interesting that you say young market, because banking obviously was very, very different in terms of its levels of maturity then at the time of open banking than the EV charging market is now. Almost an emerging market in its way. It's certainly very novel. A lot of the technology is relatively less mature than the technologies involved in banking. And also I'd add the caveat that as much as obviously the CMA has explicitly called out open banking and the Open Data Initiative and a lot of the things that came out from there, indeed coming up to open energy in the energy sector as good standards and the freedom to mandate interoperability and mandate a set of data standards. These were in response to a market failure. Arguably, the banking sector was in a considerable time of crisis, and I think there was a situation where something had to be done. It was a response to failure, which gives a slightly different regulatory position in that there is a greater appetite for a top-down, centrally mandated standard that everyone agrees to than a situation where we don't know how the technology is going to fall out. We don't know who the significant players are. We don't know where potential monopoly power could accrete around certain choke points and develop areas where companies can have greater or more significant market status. Those are yet to kind of develop within the EV charging market, which I think is interesting. I mean, there's the old joke that when you have 15 competing standards for something and you say this, we'll agree them and we'll put them all together and we'll achieve one data standard, within 6 months you'll have 16 competing data standards all going forward. And I think with that, it's going to be interesting to see what comes out. I have personally a greater degree of faith in the idea of standardizing APIs rather than standardizing specific data standards or formats, because I think there's, in a way, it's a technical enabler, an API that's going to allow, to a degree, differing data standards to be pulled into one functional use. It almost works like a third-party intermediary, as Anna was mentioning, or indeed a kind of technical equivalent of principles-based regulation. The actual technical specifics aren't quite as important as meeting the agreed standard. That said, there's some argument to be made that API standardization is difficult in and of itself. So I think it's certainly somewhere where there's a lot to be said for it. I would say as well, I'll cover that later on. Yeah, with the charging, I think there's an argument that standardization has to not just be technical, not just be legal. It also has to have an economic case to it as well, which I think is going to be an interesting future. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Charles. I think you've raised a very important point on standardizing APIs and the difficulties of it. And I would maybe like to bring in Enzo from Huawei to give us a perspective from a ICT perspective. And so how do you think interoperability can be improved, and what do you think that what role APIs play in ensuring that interoperability?
Thanks a lot, Marla. I mean, surely APIs do have an important role here. Maybe talking about it by itself could be useful here as well. When we talk about APIs here, we talk about really what would allows different devices, but also different actors to interact with each other and the technologies to interact with each other. Without them, we're not sure that there will be an interface that will allow a specific technology to interact with another one. In the case of the EV chargers, it was very well explained by Quentin before. What are the needs? What they don't have access to? What's the issues? And he mentioned 15.11.8. This is a very good example of a situation when you have a standardized interface sort of that will allow this. Now, the question is the question that we've heard in many different tech policy discussion before, and that's why it was very interesting for me to listen as well to what was said before, because it seems that these conversations, they will apply to every single sector basically, because it's not the first time that I hear about the issue concerning vendor lock-in. That's not the first time I hear about consumer lockout when it comes to having access to your data. And it seems that it's always coming back to whether or not, what APIs do we want? How do we agree on the specific API? What sort of discussion and place and area that we have to discuss about those APIs that we want to have? So surely there is work to be done here. Now I look at the report, because the report is recommending mandating APIs, if I'm not wrong. Giuseppe, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And I think it's an interesting discussion to have. How do we make sure that different players, or at least key players, are using similar APIs? And if we don't do this, how do we make sure that there is no, because that's also what the report mentions as well, some sort of localized market or centralized player on the market? How do we make sure that this doesn't create some issues when it comes to other players wanting to integrate the markets? That's a conversation we've had, and I mentioned that act before, but I think the text, and Giuseppe also mentioned the Digital Market Act as well, that is dealing with competition, and it's strange because somehow it is related to these points, and that's what Quentin mentioned before, what also Charles is mentioning before. So yeah, that's where APIs land here. That seems to be a very small point, but it's actually a very important point in that case. So yeah.
Thank you, Enzo. Thanks a lot for also pointing out again the importance to avoid a customer lock-in. I would like to give the floor to Anna and go back a bit to what we talked about in the beginning, just to maybe hear a bit more about, because we talked about different actors in the governance process, what the different roles are for the customers involved to share the data and to avoid that lock-in, because you were talking about a user-centered approach on data access, and maybe you could share a bit more about this with us.
Yeah, I think I mostly said already how the concept works. The user can be a business or a consumer, and the user is the one who owns, rents or leases the product. And this user would have direct access or be able to select a third party who gets access. So that's the framework around IoT data access in the Data Act. But maybe allow me also to say a few words what else we do also with the Data Act, because I hear there are also, other links to what we do, and one of them is, for example, the contractual fairness part. So the Data Act also provides rules on fairness in contractual B2B data sharing constellations, where a contract is unilaterally imposed on an SME, and here we try to avoid abusive clauses and bring the SME back to the negotiating table when it comes to agreements on data sharing. And I think this can be also very relevant here, because we see in the Data Act also, when we speak about the IoT data access, that many of these interactions will be based on contracts, and contracts will play an essential role here. And so it will be a lot of interest will be focused on how to make those contracts work and what is in those contracts. And so for a part of these contracts, we at least provide for fairness with those fairness rules in chapter 4 of the proposal. And then of course we also look at interoperability, which plays an important role in this discussion here today, with providing basically a mandate to the Commission to step in where standards led by industry don't suffice. So it's a very broad rule there, because of course we're dealing with a horizontal framework here, and it also looks at cross-sectoral data use with a specific focus on the creation of common European data spaces like the energy data space. But this is just to say that there is work going on also on interoperability from this horizontal perspective, and it goes together actually with what we already did with the DGA, because there is a new board that is foreseen with the DGA, the European Data Innovation Board, that will also look at the prioritization of standardization activities that are ongoing in different areas and in different organizations at European, international level, etc. So there is a strong focus, I would say, on this topic of interoperability that always plays an important role when we speak about the data economy, of course, because standards can lead to lower transaction costs and of course enhance then the data sharing between actors. That's clear. But I just wanted to stress also that it's clear that we have also the need of sectoral rules then when it comes to specific scenarios like the one we are discussing now. And this link is also clear from the Data Act when we speak about the interaction with other legislative files. And I think this is a very good example for technical aspects of data access that need to be looked closer at in sectoral legislation.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned, again, the interoperability issues, and especially for cross-sectoral data use. So I would maybe again bring back Charles into the discussion, because we've just talked about open banking strategy. But in addition to that, maybe generally, what can we learn from the UK with regards to sector-specific rules and their cross-sectoral transferability?
Sector-specific rules is, I think, somewhere where in some aspects, the UK is a little bit behind Europe, looking at the fact you've got the shared European health data space, which is coming together and is suggesting for the fact that health data is obviously such a contentious and complicated area of bringing together data standards, bringing together the correct protections. You also have obviously the risks for cybersecurity, because we've seen a plethora of ransomware across various health bodies, both in the UK and the EU, and yet there is a willingness within the EU to kind of grasp the nettle with that, whereas in the UK, our NHS data is perhaps not as mature there, and certainly there's a lack of standardization in between trusts nationally, let alone on an international basis between member states. So there's times certainly when I'm looking across at the EU with a slightly envious eye, mandating standards, and we go back to the point of charging that we're talking about here. There's the phone chargers, where there's a mandated charger cable. I think there's parallels to be drawn from that in the nascent mobile phone market. There were hundreds of different chargers, weird and wonderful ways to connect them, and they all thinned out and formed a kind of market standard of micro USB with one holdout of iPhone with the lightning cable that was unique. And so of course you effectively have two standards there, which was never going to rationalize itself through market forces alone, because iPhone was too large to simply acquiesce to general market standards. The EU has gone for a top-down mandate that micro USBs will be the standard, and iPhone can fall in line to an extent. I think we'll be able to see similar parallels with the EV charging cases, but obviously it's substantially more complicated to have a bidirectional electronic vehicle charging than it is for a simple mobile phone. We're not just talking hardware standards of the plug connection, we're talking software standards of the charging side, we're talking data standards of how the information's put forward, connectivity standards, legal standards, what's the common licensing for that, and then even to an extent, as Sean Giuseppe mentioned in the paper, economic standards, where would be the kind of agreed arbitrage point for the sale of electricity in a bidirectional view. So I think this not only cuts across multiple sectors for these rules, for these standards, but we're going to have multiple standards across different disciplines, for want of a better word. My personal viewpoint, and I hasten to add this is not necessarily the view of Ofgem, but this is my personal viewpoint, it's there will be a necessity for top-down mandating. I cannot foresee it will evolve naturally, but that's again purely my personal viewpoint, and I'd be quite happy to be proved wrong, because I think there's a greater opportunity for innovation and less potential for monopoly power getting held with EV manufacturers if it does evolve naturally. Thank you, Marla.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks for pointing out other different disciplines, health data sharing. I think that's a very good aspect. I would like to ask Enzo on this topic and on other sectors and interoperability problems. Do you see any similar elements in energy data sharing and other tech policy discussions just over the last few years?
Thanks, Marla. Yes, definitely. I think Anna mentioned it before as well with all the horizontal rules. When I was listening to what Charles was saying before, but also throughout the conversation, what I thought of is what I hear a lot in the cloud sector as well. And it's very interesting to hear when Quentin was mentioning his specific use case and specific use of or non-use of specific APIs and basically open interfaces is the cloud market. So because you have many players in the cloud market, which is a very concentrated market in the EU, that are complaining because they are completely locked out of the market on specific cloud services. You also have consumers obviously complaining because they cannot sometimes have clouds that can interoperate with each other. And the cost that it creates for them on the market, rather than optimizing, they end up with a situation when it costs more than it should be costing. And this is definitely a line that I would draw between the two cases. And I know it could be surprising because here we're talking about energy data sharing, but I think this is the example that is at least the closest that I find, because here we're talking about two things, right? We're talking about three things actually, now that I think about it. The lockout that I mentioned before, so the idea that new organization can enter the market, and new products, new technologies, new services can enter on the market, which would be beneficial for the market, but also for consumers, customers, etc., etc. Then you have the consumer lock-in, again, that was mentioned that many times, but then you also have the innovation side of it. It's how, if I have a super innovative service, and I've completely innovate, how can I integrate the market without having to arrive with massive investment, control the entire infrastructure, control different services that are also relying on. And this is exactly the conversation that's happening on the cloud market. And it's very interesting to be able to sort of draw the lines between the two as well. So that's where I would, and obviously the Data Act is also looking in the cloud lock-in, lock-out, interoperability, etc., etc. So that's also interesting to see how all of this is connected.
Thank you very much. And so looking at the time before we start the question and answer section, and also open up the discussion a bit to our online audience, I maybe ask members of the academic team to just maybe quickly react on what they've heard so far. Maybe starting with you, Sean.
Thank you, Marla. I kind of am very taken by this idea that the hands-off approach to the market and letting the market decide will not necessarily lead to the best outcome for everybody. That's one of the points I draw from some of these comments, which I think is extremely important, because it is effectively suggesting that a view that we let the market decide, which sounds like a very pro-competitive view, can actually lead to closing down of possible competing contracting scenarios and create a form of mini monopoly. So that's the points I would draw from some of these comments, which have been very, very interesting.
Thank you. Giuseppe, would you like to add something?
Well, yeah, I would say that Sean is right. I mean that from our perspective, our concern seems to be confirmed about the risk that the sort of bottom-up market-led approach is not necessarily going to succeed, and that's from a policy perspective is, I would say, the key point, because that's what about the mandating or facilitating the adoption of API. It seems to me that also the panelists share our concern about how much successful could be the market in this situation to deliver different solution and effective solution. From this point of view, unfortunately, it seems that the concern that we raise in the report is shared by our panelists.
Thank you very much. So we've in the meantime had a look at our questions from the audience, and the first one goes to you, Giuseppe, so you can stay right with us. The question is from Philip Christ, and he's asking, we are entering the space of continuous data portability, not only volunteer data, but of observed data. This is addressed in part in the new Data Act. So where are we in the energy sector vis-a-vis the technical and legal feasibility of continuous personal data portability with respect to charging?
Well, yes, that's a very interesting point. Let me point it out, first of all, that Philip is right. Somehow this problem is addressed by the Data Act. I mean that if you look at the proposal Data Act, one of the way in which the Data Act, let's say, departed from the GDPR is that the Data Act states that data involved should be made available continuously and in real time, whether the data portability of the GDPR is designated as a sort of one-off data transfer. And this is pretty relevant because one of the critiques that has been raised towards the GDPR data portability within the digital market is how much is effective due to the fact that there is a lack of guaranteeing the continuously and in real-time way. However, when it comes to, and I'm comparing GDPR and Data Act because they are horizontal interventions, so they are going to apply to any kind of sector involved. At the same time, there is something that is pretty critical in the proposal of Data Act, that is the fact that the scope of Data Act is limited to data that are not necessary data that are derived from the sources. So the fact that the scope of Data Act is potentially limited. It is just limited to raw data. And I would say that in the IoT is not necessarily easy to find a boundary when the data is generated by user and when there are non-user generated data. So it's not necessarily so easy in the Internet of Things to delineate the difference between raw data and derived data. When it comes to energy, well, it seems to me that we have two proposals underway that try to promote the real-time access to what could be relevant information. We have the proposal directive of renewables that is related to the information to battery management system. And then we have the proposal for regulation in deployment of alternative fuel infrastructure, whether there is another provision that should allow, should mandate operators or recharging point that they receive all public accessible recharging points operated by them are digitally connected. That means that they are able to send and receive information in real time and that could be communicated bidirectionally with the electricity grid and the electric vehicle. So in the energy sector, we have a couple of provisions that should ensure real-time access to some information. But when it comes to the relationship between personal and non-personal access to real-time information, this is something that is going to be better addressed in the relationship between Data Act and GDPR. Because again, these are the two horizontal interventions. So I would say that when it comes to the made available on real-time personal data, this is something that is probably should better address and clarify in the Data Act. So far in the Data Act, we have this possibility, but again, it's just related to raw data. So one of the questions is, well, raw data that comes from, for instance, from vehicles are enough, or we should include also derived data, I mean, non-user generated data.
Thank you very much. So I'd maybe like to ask George if he's still with us. Do you maybe want to complement something on this issue?
Well, I think that's that's a detailed discussion to be had in the with regard to different aspects on data exchanges and personal versus non-personal data. And indeed, there's the framework consists of horizontal legislation which is proposed, and other discussion like the Data Act, and some vertical or sectoral data exchange requirements which are included in various energy regulations, which again are proposals and are under discussion. So I think we'll need to see what would be the outcome of the co-decision procedure, and see what are the legal texts, and there's still scope for adjustment, and we'll take it from there. But I think here the key would be also to have a discussion group, a group of experts that are looking at this in the EU. And we have one on energy, which will further develop, and there's one on mobility. And these will cooperate together for these cross-sectoral aspects. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaking of groups and concrete steps, we also have a question to you, George, on what exactly are these concrete steps to the action plan for the next month beyond energy data sharing, and how can the industry plug in and contribute?
Well, there are the action plan. It sets some actions for the next years. I have to look at it, and them I don't know all of them by heart, but I think the industry will clearly have a role in this, well, establishing and making the data exchanges in energy as functional and as swift as possible, and especially here where there are various interests, as we've seen in these discussions. We have vehicle manufacturers, we have companies that are developing innovative services for both the electricity and the mobility purposes. We have different players from different bit walls or ecosystems, and these can be brought together and finding the best solutions. The other components of the digitalization for energy action plan, they refer to grid investments, they refer to energy efficiency of appliances. So it's a diverse setup. I wouldn't know what exactly to respond, what would be the industry or the manufacturers input there. But just please have a look, and if you flick right at the end of our communication, there's a table with that summarizes all the actions, and you can choose for yourselves. And certainly there will be a number of calls over the next period for us to cooperate.
Thank you very much, Georgia. Let's encourage everyone to have a look at the action plan. So we're coming towards the end of the discussion. Can I maybe give the floor back to Sean, and maybe to provide some closing remarks on what you've had today, and yeah, conclude.
Well, just based on what we've discussed today and with the panel and George's presentation, I think it's pretty clear that we are entering into a critical phase right now in the few years ahead in terms of the infrastructure rollout of both batteries and charging points, charging stations. So charging stations can be unidirectional or bidirectional. And in most of the time we've been focusing in this report on bidirectional charging stations. It's not inevitable that they be installed in a bidirectional fashion. And so it may be that the cost difference between unidirectional and bidirectional is quite modest in the end. I think that's likely to be the case based on some things we've heard. But at the moment, there is a more substantial price difference between the two than a minor one. And I think what we have right now is a time in which both charging stations and batteries are rolling out, and we need incentives that are sufficient for both of those to be rolled out in a way that works together. So we haven't talked much about the charging stations, but I think it's important also to leave a possibility for charging stations to have an incentive to operate in a bidirectional manner and a good return on investment, just as as it may be important to have a good return on having a battery capability in the long run. So that's how I would conclude, and I think there may be a real role for regulation here because there may end up being a market failure but that doesn't make it perfectly clear what type of regulation may be necessary in the long run. We've been talking about some options today, and I think there's still a need for a lot of clarification of what those options are and some relatively fast decisions. Maybe I'll hand over to Giuseppe in case he wants to make a final note.
Thank you, Sean. Actually, you already said, I would say, everything. To sum up, again, I do believe that there is a relevant trade-off in this market. It's not easy to take insight from other experiences because there are so many players, different players involved. And there is a trade-off between innovation and effectiveness of data sharing. So we all agree on the fact that the data sharing framework is key to promote the smart charging of electric vehicles. There are pros and cons in mandating or facilitating to some extent different type of standardization. The number of players involved, and so also the risk that Sean several times highlighted about mini monopolies is something that probably should be taken seriously into account, because it is true that we are in the early stage. At the same time, if we run the risks to have an highly concentrated market, that will be a problem also from the long run term.
Thank you very much both for drawing these conclusions, and thank you to all of the panelists, presenters, the audience online for that great discussion. We encourage everyone to get in touch with us if you have any further comments, questions. As said before, we will share the link of the report as well if anyone hasn't read it yet. Our next report here at SARE will be on digital identity on the 24th of October, anyone who wants to join. And yeah, I wish everyone a great rest of the day and hope to speak soon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Have a good end of the day.